right, hello again from the Ronald Reagan Minuteman Missile State Historic Site. My name is Rob. I'm the site supervisor out here working on behalf of the State Historical Society of North Dakota. And today we're going to try to elaborate and talk a little bit more about the Stanley R. Mickelsen Safeguard Complex. We do have a video, it's about a half hour long, out there on YouTube right now. But we want to approach some of the myths of Nekoma, the pyramid, because we've run across a lot of that in our research in the past year. So basically our site, the Ronald Reagan Minuteman Missile State Historic Site, looks like this. You can see it on video there. We look more like a house. This is definitely not us. This is about an hour and a half north of us. You're getting close to the Canadian border. And basically what we try to do here is talk not only about the Minuteman Missile Force, but the entire Cold War history of North Dakota, which is very fascinating. There's like a lot of aspects to it. And we certainly invite you up here for a tour. We do provide tours of this site by appointment in the wintertime, and then we have different hours during the spring, summer, and fall months. So this site here is not open to the public. This one is in private ownership, and this building here is actually operated by U.S. Space Force. So with the Stanley R. Mickelsen Safeguard Complex, what we're seeing here is that there's a lot of different ideas of how long it was open, how much it cost, and even its role as a conspiracy site. So basically, we want to approach that today from a historical perspective and kind of try to set the record straight on some of the facts about this very fascinating part of North Dakota Cold War history. So right now we're looking at the MSR pyramid. That's more closely associated of what the Safeguard Complex was all about. And apparently there's just a lot of conspiracies out there regarding pyramids. I'm not sure how that's all about, but the perimeter acquisition radar building here out by Cavalier, North Dakota is actually still in service. I think I mentioned that before, but is also a part of the Safeguard Complex. So that's one myth we want to bust right now, I suppose, is that it only operated for one day. Well, part of the complex is actually still in use, there again by U.S. Space Force. So one quick thing about the pyramid is that why was it shaped like a pyramid? Well, with these circular, basically islets, these are radar faces, phased array radars, very state-of-the-art for the time. And basically it needed to point in four separate directions to look out not only towards the North Pole, where possible Soviet missiles are coming in from, but also back southwest and southeast, because there was the possibility of submarine-launched ballistic missiles potentially attacking the Grand Forks missile field. So essentially, this all goes back to the idea of anti-ballistic missiles. It was a 20-year development, ranged from Nike Zeus all the way to Safeguard by 1969, 1970. And basically, you're seeing this kind of extension of the nuclear arms race, whereas the Soviets are developing their new ABM system around Moscow. It's not as sophisticated as this, but basically the United States responds by the development of the Multiple Independent Reentry Vehicle and decoys on a part of their ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Force, to overwhelm and basically mess with those ABM radars around Moscow. And basically the United States says, well, we're going to develop an ABM system as well, and it basically gets watered down eventually to one site in North Dakota, and basically resulted in balloon costs in the days of the post-Vietnam War drawdown with U.S. military forces and budgets. Watergate's going on at this time. There's a lot of political influence that resulted in this site being open for a very short time, but longer than 1 day. So let's talk about the first myth here. The site cost $5.7 billion to build, or $29.3 billion in 2021 dollars. And the fact is, not exactly. Basically, we look at one source from Senator Milton Young of North Dakota, who was in the Senate at the time. He approached the Office of the Budget in 1972 asking, you know, this great big amount of money that's being spent on this system, how much of it is actually going into North Dakota? Because the myth goes is that this one pyramid cost $6 billion to build. And actually, he gets a letter back that says, like, there's basically $3 billion being sunk into a lot of installation, the whole complex up here in North Dakota. So you have to remember, back in the 1960s, there was something called Nike X, a forerunner to Safeguard, if you will, basically saying it's like, we're going to build these missiles, defensive missiles, to protect major American cities and defense areas. Kind of like what Nike Hercules, an air defense missile, did before those were all phased out of city service around 1974, because basically the Soviets worked on missiles instead of bombers. The Nike Hercules would have nothing to shoot down, basically had there been a nuclear war, because they couldn't engage missiles. But you had Nike X, which could engage missiles. Went on to Sentinel. Sentinel kind of condenses the sites down to 15, and by Safeguard you get to 12 sites. So in 1969 they were saying, we're going to spend so many billions of dollars on 12 anti-ballistic missile sites, and that one up there in North Dakota, protecting the Grand Forks missile field, was going to be the first. In June 1970, a few months after groundwork started getting underway for the Grand Forks site, they started working on a Malmstrom, Montana site as well to protect their missile field. So basically, as this is going on, at the same time, you have the strategic arms limitation talks, which the Soviet Union and the United States are basically discussing. Well, maybe we should peak our nuclear weapons, not peak, slow down deployment, or kind of cap deployment, let's say, of strategic forces. But this also includes anti-ballistic missile systems. So in May 1972, a treaty is signed between the United States and the Soviet Union, basically saying each country is allowed 2 ABM sites, one to protect one of their missile fields and the other to protect a national command authority site. So Russia already has one around Moscow. They never really do any work to protect any of their missile fields, but the United States had elected to protect one of its missile fields up here in the Grand Forks area. There was a later idea of possibly defending Washington, but it's pretty much shelved. So with work in Montana being 10% complete, they scrap everything out there after a little over $200 million had been spent on that system, that site, and everything is basically diluted down into this one site. So you're looking from 1969 to 1975 that a 12-site system all of a sudden is just being concentrated into one site. So essentially, the $5.7 billion figure comes from a fairly popular source from the New York Times, November 25th, 1975, saying, we're going to shut down the system. This is how much we spent on that. That's kind of crazy, after it was only open for a very short amount of time. But the $5.7 billion actually represented not only building this site, but in Montana, testing and development. That meant they were testing the missiles out there in the Pacific. And the complex is made up much more than this pyramid, but there's also the perimeter acquisition radar, as you saw before, associated underground power plants for each site. They had non-technical areas that basically were made up of administrative buildings, barracks, cafeterias, things of that nature, but also the remote sprint launcher sites, of which there were 4 geographically located around the Langdon, North Dakota area, and they're still there. But also water lines, communication systems, the data processing systems they put into this pyramid and the PAR, but also a ballistic missile defense center down there at Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado. So this system represented a whole lot of work in many places in the United States, but basically you're getting down to $3 billion being spent in the North Dakota area for the whole complex. And there again, that's 1972. One thing to consider in the early 1970s is that inflation is really going, and a lot of that's driven by high oil prices. So, and this is a map of basically the deployment for Sentinel before it was changed down to the 12-site Safeguard program deployment. So here again, Grand Forks is a part of the Sentinel program as well, but basically, they're going to start with Grand Forks, they're going to get to Malmstrom, they're going to get these sites done. Phase 2 is basically going to be Whiteman Air Force Base Defense and an F.E. Warren Air Force Base Defense in Wyoming, Whiteman down there in Missouri, to defend America's Minuteman missile force. So why do you put them around Minuteman missile fields as opposed to cities? Well, even as of 2021, no anti-ballistic missile system is 100% effective. So basically, if you're trying to defend the city, a few warheads get through the defensive screen. Nuclear warheads detonating over a city is a very bad thing. It's usually a bad thing all around. But in a missile field, it's a little less populated out here. but, then again, I live here, so I wouldn't want that either. But getting back to the point, is that you had 150 individual missile silos that you would have to take out. And so if the system is even a little bit effective, that meant you could preserve your missiles from a Soviet surprise attack and retaliate, which creates more credibility on the part of your nuclear deterrent force, which means it's less likely for an enemy to want to try to attack you if they know they can't take out all of your missiles or bombers or submarine forces at once. So here's the next one here. It was only open for a day, and that is very much false. This comes from the idea that on October 1st, 1975, the U.S. Army declares the site fully operational. The missiles are there, the radars are working, the communication lines are working. We are ready to engage Soviet missiles if they try to attack the Grand Forks area. And there was actually a depth of defense on a part of the long-range Spartan missiles that were deployed here, 30 of them, along with 70 short-range Sprint missiles. But basically, you're defending not only the Grand Forks missile field, but the Spartan missiles could defend basically all the way down into northern Kansas. It was a very large area defense, but there again, you only had 30 Spartans to work with. So on October 2nd, 1975, the popular story goes is that Congress votes to shut down the system. Well, they did. Basically, this was a part of a budgeting process for the next fiscal year. And one of the amendments in there was basically to defund the Safeguard program altogether of that site. So it had to go through the Senate. Basically, it had to be signed by President Gerald Ford in early 1976. And on February 10th, 1976, historical records denote that the Army pulled the plug on the data processing system, which effectively killed the site. So it was actually open for a little bit longer. Instead of a day, it was open for several days at least, several weeks. And there was actually an initial operational capability on April 1st, 1975, with basically what we're looking at 28 Sprint missiles and 8 Spartans. So there was a very limited defense capability back in April 1975. And even the perimeter acquisition radar was being used in 1974 for testing. Basically, they're learning that there was a lot of uses for that perimeter acquisition radar that's still in use. So here again, this has been operating for much longer than one day. This was a part of the Stanley R. Mickelsen Safeguard Complex, but in 1977 it was handed over to the U.S. Air Force, and as of 2021 it is operated by U.S. Space Force. So the nice thing about the perimeter acquisition radar is that the Air Force already had early warning systems set up at Clear, Alaska, Thule, Greenland, and Flying Dales in England, called the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, that was set up in the early 1960s. The problem with BMUS, as it was called, was that it had a capability of detecting Soviet missiles within about 15 minutes of launch, but they couldn't tell where they were really going. The PAR system could basically pick out those warheads coming in and out of the atmosphere, and they could plan the trajectories as far as like this missile's heading for Omaha, this one's heading for Denver. Basically, it was called an attack characterization system, and the Air Force found that very useful as far as early warning tasks go. But this also had an 1,800-mile range, and it still does, to track objects in orbit. So, as we're coming along in the 2020s now, we're learning more about space warfare, and this is a key part of Space Force operations. Myth number 3 is that it's a top secret meeting site for aliens or the stonecutters, if you catch that reference there. As a part of the Historical Society, our task here is to interpret history, specifically Cold War history in North Dakota, and we are out there to seek the truth. Basically, we will present histories, we will work with that, and we want to identify both the triumphs and the tragedies, what was good and what was bad. That doesn't really include aliens on our part because that's just not what we really research. It's not our area. Talk to us about like tactical radar systems, ballistic missile warheads. That's what we're here for. As far as kind of the conspiracy stuff around this site is that we're not really sure what to tell you. We don't see it in the official histories, so basically we'll just leave that up to you. I'll just put it this way. Here's me, and here's the pyramid. And here's the interior of the pyramid. So if you're thinking of like a government meeting place, some kind of secret place, I'll just tell you, whoever's doing the maintenance for that conspiracy site is kind of dropping the ball. Let's just say that. Basically in 1977, what really happened is that the Army told scrappers, hey, if you really want to go in there and scrap all the metal, we're going to give you a very short time to do it, so go crazy. And basically they came in, they scrapped out a lot of stuff. The Army closed up the site. And in 1980, for some reason, the Army said, we kind of want to get back in there. So they basically broke the welds on some of the doors to get back in. And what they found was a bunch of groundwater in the lower levels, a lot of rust, a lot of peeling paint. The scrappers took metal wherever. And so there's a lot of hazardous areas in here in which you want to be careful about where you're walking around. So like this picture here, I don't know if you can see it too well. There's torch marks on the wall where they ripped out the door. There was at one point some water down there in some of the lower levels. Sprint maintenance equipment. This is actually in one of the bunkers near the missile field. These are Sprint cells. The Sprint missiles were down below. They would fire up through that membrane to intercept possible Soviet warheads. But this is just what you're going to see on the inside. There again, the radar face. It was very cold in there that day. So there was like ice buildup actually along the walls. And this is like the interior of that right there, which was kind of cool to see. But we'll just point out this fact here is that Cavalier County Job Development Authority has control of the site. They do have video surveillance. It is patrolled. If you're a YouTuber, if you're an Instagrammer, don't trespass. It's a very dangerous place to get into. I mean, we had lights in there. We had a guide basically showing us where we should and shouldn't walk. And to any extent anyway, trespassing is bad. So the Cavalier County Job Development Authority website has a great virtual tour that you can access online. And not to mention there is the srmsc.org website, which has a plethora of photos, a great way to learn about this fascinating complex. So, if there's something in there, I didn't see any little gray men, or whatever they call them, aliens, when I was there. No meeting places. What I saw was a fairly deteriorated Cold War structure that looks pretty good on the outside, but basically Cavalier County Job Development Authority is doing a lot of work to try and get the site up to speed as far as trying to attract businesses to the area, to attract jobs, to establish jobs and employment in the area. So, but also some interpretive, ideas too to help present the history of this one-of-a-kind site. So here again, YouTubers, Instagrammers, don't trespass. There's a lot of cool videos about it. They do not offer public tours at the present time. In fact, I had to sign a waiver to go in there. The last myth we're going to approach today is that it would not have worked. And the fact is, it's kind of hard to say. So we're looking here at an airburst of a nuclear weapon. I believe it's Operation Tightrope during the 1962, following up Operation Dominic out there in the South Pacific. The United States and the Soviet Union, about the same time, are figuring out, hey, if you detonate nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, it wreaks havoc on electronic systems. In fact, there was a test back in 1958, a fairly high-yield warhead detonating fairly high in the atmosphere. Basically, it's starting off car alarms and garage door openers in Hawaii. It's blowing out streetlights, and they're like, we need to study and see what this is all about. So we're learning a lot about EMP in the early 1960s. One other thing to point out about the Safeguard system is that it was never guaranteed to blunt a massive attack. So basically in the late 1960s, both sides are really pursuing ICBM development. The United States peaks out around 1,054 ICBMs, that's not counting warheads, whereas the Soviets kind of keep going after the late 1960s. So by 1975, the United States is facing on the ICBM force alone from the Soviet Union probably a little over 2,000 warheads. Safeguard was built to defend a hardened structures as far as missiles go, ICBMs, the Minuteman missiles. like Oscar Zero, the command site here, for a flight of 10 Minuteman missiles, but not cities, because there again, no ABM system is going to be 100% effective. And what is basically going on here is that Safeguard could handle a very limited nuclear attack. Let's say somebody goes crazy and launches like a single or a couple ICBMs to the United States. It's a good chance the Safeguard program, missiles, Spartans, and Sprints are going to successfully intercept that. Also, a limited nuclear attack from the Chinese, which was a growing concern in the late 1960s. But a massive nuclear attack, I mean, not all of those 2,000 warheads are going to be raining down in the Grand Forks area. And you got to remember there's only 100 interceptor missiles, but it could still be overwhelmed. And we'll talk a little bit about that going on next. First, the EMP angle, electromagnetic pulse. It's a very scary phenomenon because basically it's not affecting biological people or animals or anything like that. It could possibly fry electronics. So one thing we like to kind of brag about with the Grand Forks Minuteman Force sites is that they had a different contractor, and they were built, actually they were some of the last ICBM sites ever built by the United States. So what is basically going on is that we're learning about EMP. Some of our first ICBM sites, Atlas and Titans, aren't really well configured against protecting against EMP. So by the time they get the Grand Forks, we have a lot of different features at this site, particularly underground, that was very much meant to protect the capsule and the electronics within it. There's EMP alarms. There were welded plate techniques. Basically, they went in and were very careful about welding these plates in there to make sure no electronic signals can come in. In fact, around our blast door downstairs that weighs about 8 tons, there's a fine mesh of metal to protect the inside, basically kind of like a Faraday cage, if you will. Electrosurge arrestor room. So basically everything's being completed here in 1965, 1966. Safeguard program is being constructed in the early 1970s. And you look at some of the engineering documents, there's some rooms in the MSR pyramid that are strictly protected by liner steel plate from EMP. And there's a lot of techniques basically working to protect the system. But it's still plausible. I mean, it's really hard to protect everything. There's some areas where the shielding might not be as strong. So it's conceivable that an EMP could maybe not disable the system, but really degrade the capability of it. And there again, we just don't know because luckily we've never had a nuclear war. And here again from there, going on to inaccuracy of the missiles. So during the testing program, there were 54 tests of the missiles conducted. 47 of those tests achieved objectives. 2 of them were partly successful and 5 were failures. So if you had 54 missiles protecting a city and you had 5 failures, that's not good. But for a missile field with 150 targets, you're still protecting a good deal of that force, and there again, credible nuclear deterrent. One thing to point out is that these tests were planned. They were under fairly ideal laboratory conditions, and it's hard to, there again, replicate nuclear war as far as how these things are going to be racing skyward with air bursts of nuclear weapons or even ground bursts nearby, how that was going to degrade the system. So just kind of like EMP, that was something they couldn't test for, and luckily we never had to get to that point, or else I probably would not be talking to you today. And lastly, overwhelming the system, it probably. Warhead numbers are growing on both sides. Basically, the United States effectively looked at the Moscow ABM system. They had 100 interceptors, so they're like, we're just going to send 101 missiles at the site. Or, we're going to overwhelm it with decoys, multiple independent reentry vehicles. That's one of the reasons that's being introduced in the late 1960s is to overwhelm and take over ABM systems. And then the Russians follow suit. So Safeguard, was it going to work? It had a good chance from all the records that I've researched myself. I had a good chance of really blunting an attack, but if it was massive enough, it was just going to be overwhelmed. That's just how it would happen. With 100 interceptors, you had a limited defensive capability. And it's the same today with our kinetic kill missiles that we have out there in California and Alaska. we do have a working ABM system. The Soviet, or I should say the Russians still do around Moscow, but there's no guarantee that either system is going to be 100% effective, because you're trying to kill a bullet with a bullet, and it's really super hard to do. But Safeguard did a lot to advance that technology to make it possible. And beyond that, you're developing phased array radar systems, data processing systems. You're learning a lot, and there's basically a lot of technology that's kind of coming out of the Safeguard program, influencing other programs, one of which is the Patriot surface-to-air missile that was used to some effect during Operation Desert Storm, and then from then on out from there. So some resources I want to point you to kind of, if you want to learn more about that site, srmsc.org, excellent site. I'm 36 now, and I've been going to that site since I was a teenager. And there's just an amazing amount of history about the tactical systems, the missile radar, everything. All the way down to Boy Scout troops and, what the families were doing at the site. It's a fantastic history, and I certainly invite you to take a look. Cavalier County Job Development Authority, there again, that virtual tour. Defense Technical Information Center, I believe it's dtic.mil. You might just try to do a web search for DTIC. Basically, a lot of great white papers and documentation on the Safeguard system that you can see there, or do a good web search, and you can find a lot of great pictures, historical pictures of this very unique site that was, the last of 12, and faced a lot of politics throughout its development and deployment. So we're going to end it there today. And once again, from the Ronald Reagan Minuteman Missile State Historic Site, we do provide tours here at this site, so feel free to give us a call. And I think we'll end it from there. My name is Rob, and we'll see you next time.